Well, welcome everybody. And today we have a guest who I think is going to please you all very, very much. Jane Mayer is, to my mind, one of the important writers in America today, dealing with an issue that I think does not get the kind of attention that it deserves, and that is the role of money in American politics. You know, you got a lot of people out there saying, oh, I'm worried about healthcare, I'm worried about the environment, I'm worried about the economy, but they are not connecting the dots in terms of the role that money plays dealing with legislation that deals with all of those issues. Jane, welcome.
Thanks.
And thanks for all you're doing. Jane, let me start off by asking you a very simple question. What is the role of money in American politics today? How significant is that issue?
I honestly think you can almost not fix anything else until you fix the situation regarding money in American politics, because it affects every issue. What's happened is private interests have kind of captured large parts of the government because they have more sway and ordinary people don't get their point of view across. So I think it's incredibly important.
Money in politics has always been important from way back when, right? I'm not a historian.
From the beginning, from
but
Adam
my
and
guess
Eve,
is
my
always
guess.
big money
Yeah.
guys were taking
Right.
care of their friends.
Right.
How is it different today? What role has Citizens United played in
You know,
process?
there's always been big money, as you say, and by the way, it's in both parties too. But what's happened is there's been an explosion of it since Citizens United. And if you take a look, I was just looking up the Watergate scandal. Today's money, the amount of money from Clement Stone, one of the evil characters in Watergate, would have been $12 million. Okay, we're looking at, in the Koch group alone, the Koch brothers have an organization, they wanted to put $889 million into the 2016 campaign. So we're looking at scandal.
Let's say that again. Let's
Okay.
say that again.
It's $12 million was the money that was considered a national scandal in the Watergate years. $889 million was the kitty that was going to be spent in 2016 by a handful of, as
the
Bernie
Koch
might,
brothers.
the Koch brothers, and a handful of, may I quote Bernie, millionaires and billionaires. Anyway, so the thing is, it's really, we're in a different place. The scale is hard to convey to people. We're in a bad place in a different place.
And let's also be clear, is that the Republican leadership and the Koch brothers are not satisfied with Citizens United. They don't think it went far enough. They would like to now repeal all campaign finance rules. Right now, Koch brothers can spend their money on independent expenditures, set up some phony group, put ads on television to attack you or to support you. Right now, what they want to do is move toward the direct funding. So if you want to run for United States Senate, here's your check for $100 million. You work for me. How far removed is that from literally making elected officials employees of the billionaire class?
Well, I mean, I think the issue, to me, it seems like legalizing bribery, really, in a way. And the other thing that they're working towards is trying to hide all the money so that there would be no transparency whatsoever.
They set up phony organizations.
So, right, and so you would then, there's an argument they make that it exposes them to criticism when they give this kind of money, and they think that that's unfair, and so they want to be able to give unlimited money without the public knowing it. And you know, it's just very hard for ordinary people's issues to get attention when there's that much money on the other side. That's the problem.
All right. Speak in the middle of this huge upsurge in dark money is the Koch brothers. Why don't you tell us a little bit about the Koch brothers and the role they have played in billionaires being able to spend unlimited sums of money?
Well, they are the owners, these two brothers, of the second largest private company in America, Koch Industries, which refines oil, makes chemicals, does all kinds of finance stuff, and has pipelines. And between the two of them, Charles and David Koch, are worth about $85 billion. So they've got a tremendous kind of unlimited amount of money to spend in American politics, and they've got very extreme views. And that's the thing that's interesting to me, was that they took these views, which were so far out on the fringe when they started getting into politics in the late 1970s. At that point, they were laughed at, basically. They ran against Ronald Reagan from the right because they thought he was a sellout. And what they've succeeded in doing, not just by spending, but by spending smartly, strategically, is move their ideology towards the center of the Republican Party at this point.
All right, let's talk about two things. I think you're right. They have used their money very intelligently, not just in terms of campaign finance support for candidates, setting up think tanks. So when you turn on CNN and we hear some economists from some group, as often as not, that group will have been funded by the Koch brothers or some extreme right-wing billionaires. Talk a little bit about the kind of intellectual infrastructure they've established.
So I think what's important is that they didn't just build an electoral machine. They have a formidable electoral machine with offices in 35 states and more private employees working for them in politics than the Republican National Committee.
But is it fair to say, I'm sorry to interrupt you,
yeah.
Some people have suggested that they are in fact politically more powerful than the Republican Party. Is that true, do you think?
You know, I don't see them. How do you measure something like that? What I see is that they have pulled. They've exerted a kind of a gravitational force pulling the Republican Party in their direction by threatening to run primary campaigns against any candidates who won't follow their line. So they push and pull the party in their direction. But what I was going to say is, okay, they've got this formidable electoral machine, but the part that was harder to report on and took so many years to figure out is they've got a parallel kind of an ideological machine that it's in some ways more influential, and it's aimed at spewing out alternative facts, basically. What to coin a phrase, or to use a phrase from Kellyanne Conway, it subsidizes academic centers that have put out papers, think tanks, advocacy groups, grassroots groups, all kinds of things that create political pressure on the ideological front in the country.
We are told that, for example, apropos of what you're talking about, that the Tea Party just was a spontaneous development of disgruntled, angry Americans. Just, they had enough. What was the connection between the Koch brothers and others in terms of the creation of the Tea Party efforts?
Well, I should say, I do think there were actual disgruntled, angry Americans. This was after the economic meltdown in 2008, and people were extremely upset. But what happened was the Kochs had by then they'd been experimenting for a number of years and had built a sort of a political infrastructure in many states that they used to corral that anger and push it in their direction. So they organized rallies, they trained people how to protest, they gave them talking points, they gave them phone numbers of who to call in Congress. And so they what was interesting to me was that kind of anger could go left or it could go right. They pushed it in their libertarian direction so that the anger was trained on the government, because that's really the enemy to them.
Right, all right. What is the connection between the Koch brothers apparatus and other right-wing groups like the NRA, et cetera?
So there's a chart inside my book that you can look at that sort of, it's kind of dizzying, but they've worked with the NRA. They've got members of the NRA who come to a conference they have twice a year with big funders. And the big money gets together with the interest groups on the right, and they distribute the money out to the various groups, and the NRA then gets its voters out.
Koch brothers give money to the NRA?
Yes, their organization does. It's some part of the NRA's funding. It's not all of the funding by any means, but they've got allied groups that they work with. Okay.
Now, what I think is not widely known, in the corporate media often describes the Koch brothers as conservatives, the truth is that correct me if I'm wrong here, in 1980, I believe, David Koch ran for vice president of the United States on the Libertarian Party ticket.
Exactly.
And I think the Koch brothers funded a good part of that effort. And they had a platform. And the platform was an extraordinary platform. During my presidential campaign, I would often speak about it. It didn't get a lot of coverage. But the bottom line, and correct me if you think they have changed their views at all, what these guys were essentially saying is, we don't want to cut Social Security or Medicare or Medicaid. We don't want to cut it. We want to end it.
That's right.
Because we believe that government itself should not be involved in retirement issues, should not be involved in health care. We don't want to cut federal aid to education. We want to end public education in America. We want to end, now you're seeing it, the Department of Energy, the Environmental Protection. We want to end all campaign finance limitations. Is that still their position?
That is their position. And that's why, I describe them in the subtitle of my book as radicals. And the thing is, it's not pejorative, me applying it, it's how they define themselves. There are quotes in the book from Charles Koch talking about how we are radicals. And they want to pull the government out by the root. And eradicate most of the New Deal, the Great Society, pretty much all the social safety net that was developed in the 20th century is where they would like to go.
And I hope everybody is hearing what Jane is saying. Essentially what she is saying is these guys want to undo every major piece of legislation passed since the 1930s designed to protect the rights of working people, the elderly, the children, the sick, and the poor. Is that a fair statement?
And maybe even before, the progressive era ones also that had to do with trying to control money in politics. They wanted to get rid of those as well. So it's kind of a Darwinian state they're aiming for. And they think, they argue that government coddles people to their own disadvantage. And that, by giving them something, it ruins their character. But, as I point out in the book, this doesn't seem to stop them from giving their own fortunes to their sons and daughters, because they are passing on very large fortunes to them, which will be bigger if they cut their taxes further.
And what is really extraordinary, and you made this point a few moments ago, they strongly opposed Ronald Reagan. They thought Reagan was too centrist, yes?
Yes.
And back in 1980, their ideas were thought to be really loony, crazy. And now, to a significant degree, you talk to Republicans, mainstream Republicans, I say, we've got to raise the minimum wage to a living wage. What do you think? Oh no, we're not going to raise the minimum wage. We're going to do away with the concept of the minimum wage. Now, right now, we just had a huge struggle that we won, at least we won the battle, on this disastrous Republican health care plan. But this beginning attack of cutting Medicaid by almost $900 billion, that's just their first effort. These guys want eventually to go all of the way. They do not believe government should play a role in protecting the environment, in health care, in workers' safety, in having a decent minimum wage. It is an extraordinarily radical undoing of everything that working people have fought for since, you say, even before the 1930s. Is that a fair statement?
Yeah, I interviewed one person at a Koch-funded think tank who was arguing that they need to get rid of child labor laws. So, it's these
Shouldn't
things.
children of 8 years old have the freedom to work in factories?
Well, and they also thought maybe there shouldn't be required schooling. It's really eye-opening when you do the reporting and you get down to, and you really press on what they're pushing for.
And I think it's fair to say mainstream media has not really, everybody knows the name Koch brothers, their impact, the amount of money they spend, but there's really been very little discussion of what they actually stand for.
Well, on this issue, I'm probably more of a fan of the mainstream media than you are, because I know what a struggle it is to be a reporter and try to get these stories. It took me 5 years to do this book, and it's hard. It's hard, and I think I come out of the mainstream media, so I have to defend my people.
All right, well, you defend them.
Okay.
Let's change gear a little bit. There's a gentleman lately who you have been writing a lot about, and that has to do with the relationship of Robert Mercer
Yes.
and Donald Trump. Who is Robert Mercer, and how does he relate to Trump?
Well, so if you kind of imagined that the Koch brothers had a mini-me, it might be the Mercer family, a family that is extraordinarily rich. Robert Mercer is a hedge fund tycoon who, according to Institutional Investor, makes $135 million a year, but that makes him a piker compared to the Kochs. But he's taking that money and also throwing it into American politics, and his views are a lot like the Kochs. Not completely identical, but he shares their hatred of government. He he originally, the family backed Ted Cruz's candidacy in 2016, and when Cruz went down, they moved to Trump, and they became, I was interested, well, where did Trump come from? How did this happen? And part of the story that I felt wasn't really told was that there was one family with a tremendous amount of money that had been working with Steve Bannon for something like 5 years.
So they go back with Bannon for
Bannon, before Steve Bannon became Donald Trump's political advisor, he was the Mercer family's political advisor, and they supported him. So when you think of the whole sort of, the things you associate with Bannon, Breitbart News, he talked the Mercer family into putting $10 million into it and launching Breitbart News in a big way. Some of the most important critiques of the Clintons during the last campaign, the book that painted Hillary Clinton as corrupt, excuse me, Clinton Cash, was a project of Steve Bannon's and funded by the Mercer family. So they are, again, people with great influence, great fortunes that the American public doesn't really see.
And no doubt they have very progressive views on the environment.
Bob Mercer does not believe that global warming is real. He thinks if there is global warming, he argues it'll be good for people, but then he also argues that fallout from nuclear bombs, low-level radiation, is good for people, and that there was the kind of a silver lining after we bombed Japan in World War II, was that the radiation in the outskirts was good for the Japanese health. So he's got really peculiar views.
Peculiar. And this is a man who has helped elect Donald Trump to become president of the United States.
And his daughter Rebecca has mentioned the idea of a scientist who believes all these things too as our national science advisor. They've actually had some influence on picking who's in the administration, because she was on the transition team.
So when we talk about the Trump administration, we use the word, it's becoming hackneyed, I guess. We keep using the word frightening, but what can you say? And also, they're big into helping lead the effort in Islamophobia, aren't they not?
They have, well, I mean, Breitbart has been a voice of nativism, nationalism, and racism to some extent, anti-Semitism, and Islamophobia. So, you know, it's really interesting. These are not stupid people. None of them are. But they are people with extreme views that I think probably couldn't be elected if they ever ran for office, because they're so far out on the fringe, but instead they're playing shadow roles by putting their fortunes behind people who can get elected and then owe them.
Right. Now, you have covered, I think, some of the most important issues facing our country. There's another area that you have written on, and that is voter suppression and the so-called myth of voter fraud. Now, one of the areas that I am deeply concerned about is the attacks on democracy. So it's not just billionaires able to buy elections. It is a very deliberate effort on the part of many Republicans to try to suppress the vote, making it harder for poor people or older people or young people or people of color to participate. And they do that under the guise of voter fraud. That there's just, we have, as Donald Trump told us recently, 3 to 5 million people voted illegally in the last election. Otherwise, he would have gotten defeated Clinton in terms of the popular vote. Now, there's nobody of any authority, Republican or Democrat, who agrees with Trump in any way. But talk a little bit about this voter fraud mythology and what the ultimate goal here is.
Well, again, this is the kind of fake scholarship that's come out of the think tanks funded by these partisan sources. And some of the idea of voter fraud has been promoted by the Bradley Foundation, for instance, which is a nonprofit that's funded by a lot of the same right-wing money, and it confuses people. People get worried and think that their votes are, going to be stolen or the elections be stolen, and it's just
voter fraud is a serious issue if it was real.
There just is. The scholarship. If you talk to real scholars, there's no evidence of in person, that is identity voter fraud. People don't want to risk a felony by pretending to be someone else for one extra vote.
And what they do is conflate the fact that if somebody dies, they're still on a checklist.
Right.
That's voter fraud. If somebody moves, I think there are a lot of people around Trump himself who have been registered in various states. They have not.
And Steve Bannon. In several states at once, but it doesn't mean that he committed voter fraud.
Correct.
So, I mean, one of the places where this has been the biggest issue is in North Carolina,
Right.
and North Carolina is in some ways a test kitchen for the Kochs. They've poured money into it. There's one figure down there, Art Pope,
Right.
who is allied with them, who's helped create a lot of this confusion about voter fraud.
And the significance of this is that Republicans will win elections if poor people, if older people, if working class people, if people of color are kept away from the voting booths. And that's exactly what the intention of this whole effort is about, is it not?
Well, I mean, they wouldn't say so, but it certainly seems to be the effect of it. And, the one thing that you can do to balance out this kind of concentrated money is balance it with numbers.
Right.
And there are many, many, many more people in this country who are not millionaires and billionaires, and if they make it to the polls, they can make their voices heard.
Right. All right. Jane, thank you very much.
Thank you, Senator Sanders. I'm glad to be able to do this.
Well, thank you not only for being here today, but thank you for your willingness to tackle issues that not a whole lot of people are tackling, and they are some of the most important issues facing our country. So
Well,
thanks.
thanks. I'll say one last thing, which is I come out of, as a reporter, your state of Vermont. I was a reporter for the Rutland Herald, and one of the things about it is there's not that much money in Vermont politics. So we've seen that it works better without it.
Okay. Thank you all very much.